Hello and welcome back to another video on this channel, this live stream for you guys here. Today, we're not online, we're not separate together, we are together. Me and Thinker's Kitchen have gotten together. He has some nose allergies. I don't think he has a coronavirus, so it should be all right. But
perhaps I have one.
yes, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so let the camera angle go right. So I'm glad you've joined us today in our discussion. I'm joined with Thinker's Kitchen. And if you're listening from the podcast on Thinker's Kitchen, make sure you feel free to like and subscribe if you're enjoying it there, or check out my stuff as well. So that's kind of a bit of admin stuff out of the way. And without further ado, let's get into our discussion today, where we're going to be talking about the transcendence, Aristotle, Marx, and other interesting things that we're going to be talking about. So what do you want to start off with today?
Well, I guess we can start off with Aristotle. So I've been reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics recently, and it's very interesting. Like, you know, before I thought, you've read Aristotle yourself, right?
Yes.
Like,
indeed.
Before I tried to read him, he was very boring. I think maybe you felt that too.
Yes, definitely.
Extremely boring, and it just felt like he's making these endless distinctions, talking a lot, but not really getting at anything substantive. But then this time I read the Nicomachean Ethics again, and then I'm trying to. So I normally read one section and then make a summary notes of that section and go through, and it becomes very interesting. What I really love about the Nicomachean Ethics, I haven't finished it, but I think the key concept is this concept of character. Character, the etymology of character in Greek is engraving. So character is what is engraved onto you. And Aristotle has a very interesting discussion on this. Aristotle says that if the virtuous person becomes virtuous by doing virtuous things. It sounds a bit circular, right? But I think what he's saying is virtue comes from constant practice. So only by striving to do virtuous things, and by trying to do it again and again, can you build up this habit. This can virtue become engraved into you and become a part of your character. And he also talked about how virtue is best shown not in I guess contingent things that just I guess emergencies, more than things that you can plan beforehand and think about. And that virtue is how you respond to the situation, and only the emergent situation shows your true character, because it's your most spontaneous, most authentic response.
I definitely think that this is very true. It's a concept which is, I think, very interesting, because, you know, when you're looking at Aristotle, when you look at Plato, they're not just philosophers. I mean, it's very easy for us now in our modern concept to say, well, those are just philosophers. They're just focusing on like the philosophical world. But when you realize, or when you think deeper about it, you realize it's not just philosophers. They're scientists as well. They're not only trying to explain what is philosophically the case, what is metaphysically the case. They're talking about what rationally is the case. And that's, I think, very important when you're looking at Aristotle. And the Nicomachean Ethics and his morality is no other. He uses a very teleological approach to it. And although, yes, he does have these virtues, he does have a somewhat law-like structure to what these virtues are, he's also a very teleological thinker. He's thinking, well, humans are such that there is a certain purpose to humans. There's a certain way that we must act. There's a certain way we must behave. And that's the same for, I think he looks at animals. He looks at the world around us. Well, the sun, well, what's that purpose? It's to give us light. And of course, there is certain areas where teleological reasoning does seem to be abstraction, or perhaps a separation from what is scientifically now the case. We don't think of the sun as, well, it is scientifically there to give us light. It's there because it's there, and we revolve around it due to modern particles. But from that perspective, you realize that, well, maybe it's a sense of, maybe we are such that we approach the world in a teleological way, just as instead of really trying to look at just the world itself, there is perhaps a narrative structure. Yeah. There is a sense of, perhaps an extra sense of discussion that we add onto the world from our perspective, as well as what the world actually is.
Or even maybe from a kind of Heideggerian perspective, we can say that there are a lot of different ways for us to approach the world, and a lot of different ways for sun to be. In the sense that sun, if we approach the world in a scientific mood, that's what Heidegger would call a mood that we approach the world. And he says that it is only in being in a mood, being anxious, being scared, being in wonder, being in investigation, that things can really appear to us, that things can be. And the sun, I think, is no other. And Heidegger's Aristotle's theological approach is very interesting in a sense that it really seems to us that it is that way. Perhaps the being of the sun is really somehow to give us light in a certain way, and that's like Darwin's innovation is by dissolving this teleological explanation into something that's completely random without direction, but appears to have a purpose. And there's a very interesting thing, and in the metaphysics, Aristotle talks about the 4 different causes. I think, Josh, you know, but I'll just explain to the audience. There's the cause. I can't remember the official names, but there's a teleological cause. So what is this thing for? There's the form of the thing. So let's say a hammer. There's the form of the hammer, which is, if you think about it, the form of the hammer's shape is one of its cause, which is very strange. There's also like the material cause, so the material that the hammer is made of, and then there's the active cause, or the person who's like, I guess the blacksmith who's actually making the hammer. And we're in the kind of modern scientific lens, we're losing basically all of the 4 causes.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I really think is perhaps a problem of science, or of hard scientism, or just focus on science. Because I mean, that's a critique which is commonly found in the new atheists. They're like, well, that's not scientific, or well, you're not scientific enough. But exactly the question should be is, well, are you scientific as well? Like, I mean, and it's not to try to commit a two-quoque fallacy, but it's just saying, well, is science all that there is? Can we reduce everything that we see around us to science? And I think, at least from our experience of the world, the answer is a clear no. It's impossible for us to say or look at things and just say, well, science explains everything, or science explains my understanding of you or our understanding of those around us. There's a lot of things that science cannot cover, but we take as for granted, or there's a lot of things that science doesn't or cannot explain, but are just so blatantly obvious that you can't necessarily explain, or you can't necessarily describe it in any other way than an quote-unquote scientific way. For example, a water bottle, or one of your Mao Tai glasses in your cabinet. It's like, well, you have that glass. The science can tell you what exactly that glass is, the chemical structure of it, but can it really tell you what the purpose of that glass is, what actually is there to do, or what is the meaning, the significance of that glass? And that's something which I think is a very big limit of that science.
Or even just the being of the glass. Mm-hmm. Because if you do actual like science, if you look at it from a physical perspective, the glass, there's no glass anymore. There's only atoms floating around randomly. And how do we classify the world into different things and different objects when if we look from a physics perspective and they're all just particles running around? Because somehow the being of things that we normally see in the world gets dissolved in science. And that's perhaps a limit of it. It's not saying that science is useless or anything. It's obviously extremely useful. And we're lucky that so many people are doing science and there's so many scientific advances. But there truly is a limit in the explanatory scope of science.
Definitely. I think that's definitely true. And something you said just really stood out to me. It's that science itself is definitely useful, and we have to find an emergence of the science and the actual things, and it brings us to like kind of our classification, our understanding of the world, and one of the things which first comes to mind, definitely, I think, is the Wittgensteinian approach as well. Perhaps what we do see in the world is not the science itself, but rather what we assign to the science, what we assign to the physical world is what gives the world's purpose. For example, and language plays a very important part in that. It's like you look at a pillow, or you look at a couch, or you look at a glass. It's that name, it's that word, it's that concept that we have in our mind, which then applies itself via what we see in reality, the science or the physical nature in reality. And it's a combination of those two things that leads us to understand the world. And it's not just the language itself, because the language without its actual physical representation, I think we can both agree, is quite useless. And it's also the physical thing which then supports the language. And it's that kind of dual relationship which is very important.
Well, I guess, Justin, you're mainly talking about like the early Wittgensteinian approach, definitely, of the correspondence between your language and reality, and how like the atom, how logical atoms can actually correspond to states of affairs in the world.
Yeah.
But there would be another critique of science in late Wittgenstein, in that he talks about family resemblance and language games, in the sense that a word can be used in distinctly different ways in different contexts, and even I guess a single word can mean diversely different things that have no similarities between them, other than a kind of family resemblance. So maybe let's say a chair represents a lot of different chairs. Maybe some of them maybe don't have any legs instead of what we normally think of 4-legged chairs, and none of them have a complete thing that's common to them, other than some of them have some similarities with one another, and they're kind of chained together, you see. But of course, we can also think of this in an Aristotelian way when we're classifying chairs. And I think this may be more helpful in thinking about classification than scientific classification in some sense. Because how can we approach in science, using physics, let's say, to say what counts as a chair? There's no way to do it. You can't say that a chair is this size, this dimension, or there's so many atoms inside a chair, it's made of this material. But if we approach it in an Aristotelian way, we can say that a chair is a thing that is made for humans to sit on, and I think that's a very useful shift of mind that we sometimes can use to think about things.
I definitely agree with that, because I think I completely agree with you about the discussion about the ability to understand the world, and that perhaps ties into some previous Platonic ideas, and I think there is something to the Platonic forms which Plato was trying to get at, which is of significant importance. And of course, I think Plato's discussion about, well, his metaphysical side of the forms is perhaps wrong. However, his general categorization of the forms is something very reasonable, and is perhaps one of the precursors or the bridges to current set theory. It's the idea that there are certain things which can be put into these sets. There are certain categories. There are certain things which act as an umbrella term, such that such things which act out a certain property or have a certain process, or you could perhaps write it in more logical language, if X has property Y or purpose Y, then X is a part of category Z or something like that. And it's that idea which I think is very useful in everyday language or understanding of the world, which just cannot be explained by pure scientific ways. And I think that's something which is very interesting to keep in mind, if you got one.
Well, Josh, I would disagree with you here.
Yeah.
Because I think actually what you're saying is a very scientific way to think about things, in the sense that when you're saying there's a set, and in this set everything has this one property, and if a thing has this one property, it is in this set. I'll try to convert you to this kind of late Wittgensteinian approach, in the sense that when we say a word, we don't mean a thing, like the entire set of things with this one property, unless we can say like that one property is a kind of teleos. Maybe in that way we can say it, but in just one, like a kind of property that you can completely characterize or quantify in the world, I think it will be very difficult to do so. In Wittgenstein's idea, he wants to say that there is no one defining characteristic of everything under the name, perhaps chairs. Well, he wouldn't say every single word doesn't have this character, but a lot of words that we use in daily life cannot be characterized by one quality. For example, I'll ask you, what do you think is? I guess what do you think is the common quality of a chair?
Well, I think we actually agree here in the fundamental sense that the way I use this property or this idea is a very broad idea of a property, and it's because I definitely agree with you that there isn't a certain property which then everything just fits into, or there isn't a certain property that is truly defined. However, at the same time, I do think that there's this property because if you look at it, X has property Y, therefore it's a chair. It can also have many other different properties as well, and can fall into many different things. For example, my dad, he likes sitting on weird things which aren't actually chairs. He sits on the piano sometimes. He sits on the table sometimes. These aren't chairs, but I mean, and perhaps you would be right in the sense that is not technically a chair, but if you use the idea of that which is sat on to the person, that would be a sitting tool, which would, well, I suppose you are right in the sense that it isn't necessarily that property is the be all and end all of the definition of what it is to be belonging in that set.
So sorry, what would you say is this property of the chair?
Well, I think it is that which is sat on, but then the problem then arises is that, well, you could sit on a table. Would that table be a chair? Then that problem arises as well.
And also, I would also ask, what if there's postmodern artwork, and there's really a chair there, but the chair is made not to be sat on, but to be spectated.
Yes.
What do you say that thing is a chair, even if it's completely shaped like a normal chair, but it is not there for people to sit on, but for people to look at?
Well, I think that is a very interesting problem, because it goes against all our senses of what we mean by a chair, because normally because we think in a very teleological way, if you get what I mean. Like, we look at a chair and we say, well, we sit on that, that's our chair, but then at the same time, well, that chair which we've gotten our idea, or that idea from that property of it, has then gone beyond the property, and the property which classifies it as the chair is no longer its utility or its purpose, but has changed into its shape, if you got what I mean.
And also, there's also another problem with you characterizing the chair as something that we sit on. What if, let's say, there's a child who just came into the world, and who has not been properly socialized into the world? Does the chair still exist for them? Is there no chairs in his world because he doesn't see the chair as something that he can sit on?
Well, I'll disagree with that in the sense that the chair does exist, and perhaps I'm going into some sense of conceptual or societal realism, in the sense that, well, the definition or the usage of language is less so of an objective nature, but rather a tool, which is malleable and can change dependent on the certain situations. And hence, in that scenario, I would say that our usage of language is then dependent on the society which it is in. For example, the Chinese use of language is different from the English use of language, even though they're ultimately the same. And the fact that someone is just born doesn't change what. For example, perhaps perhaps the table, or the table is a table then that leads to certain problems. But I don't physically see how there is another way to look at it, in the sense that we've given because what I see is that we've given a certain thing in the reality a name, but then after we've given it the name, for example, maybe you could imagine that ancient people by a campfire, they'll call it the log that they're sitting on, that's my chair. Or they'll say that the bigger log that they're using to eat on, that's a table. But then as time has developed, although those two things are logs and are called different things, as time goes on, that chair has developed into something which normally has 4 legs and a backrest, and a table is that which has 4 legs and is flat. That has developed, it has gone beyond what we originally used chair and table to another concept. We've added a physical form to it. And then it raises a problem, is that, well, then what categorizes something as a chair anymore, when our conception of a chair has changed from something which has a property of being sat on to that which has 4 legs or 3 legs and someone sits on it, if you got what I mean.
Yeah. So I guess that's the problem that I'm trying to point at, and that's there's no single set that any word can correspond to, or any concept. And if new things can arise that we would call a chair, even though it seems completely contrary to the definition that we would give when we say a chair. For example, when you said that a chair is things we sit on, I came up with the example of the artwork of the chair. And even if you say a chair is a 3-legged or 4-legged thing, one can imagine that a chair can be 5-legged and 6-legged, and you can still call it a chair. So there's almost a seeming impossibility of characterizing anything into a single set. Whereas I guess it's a kind of defeatist position. But what Wittgenstein would say is that there is no single set, and it's just family resemblance. Some of them resemble each other, and there's some resemblance between each other, but there's no common theme.
Yeah, I think that's perhaps a good way to look at it, perhaps, and maybe you have convinced me. And perhaps the set thing perhaps works better with more defined things or more objective things like numbers, and I think with numbers it does work. Definitely. But when it comes to conceptual things in reality, then it changes. But then the problem is that, well, then isn't our language used to describe numbers also conceptual things in the same way that we describe a chair and 1 or 2? And that's also a very different question, or an interesting question that we must explore, I think.
I guess how can you even say something is 1? Because you can say there's a house. But when we say there's a house, we can also say at the same time that the house consists of a lot of different things. So and also I think Wittgenstein wouldn't disagree with you that there are some concepts that can be rigidly defined. For example, things that we use in science, because those things are defined from the start to be something. But still, in scientific things, there's a kind of rediscovery to the concept, a renewal. For example, from the concept of energy. When Einstein discovered E equals to mc squared, the concept of energy seemed to go through a shift. It's not completely stable. It's very strange compared to what we would normally think as energy. We would think that energy is like something out there, objectively defined. It's just completely us. It's just a square in which we have energy, and it doesn't expand or contract.
That's something which I have to say really, not say it necessarily bothers me, but there's a really interesting thing that we must. I think it's very difficult to find a definite answer to, and it even goes into the deeper nature of what does it mean to be an analytic truth, or what does it mean to be true by definition? Because some people say, well, something is, well, perhaps 1 + 1 = 2 is true by definition, because when you have two concepts of 1 + 1 = 2, then it must be 2, or you have 2 1s and it becomes 2, and that's perhaps a mathematical construct which is true by definition. But then you could say, well, these are linguistic sense of truth, which is found throughout, which seems to be equal throughout the world. Then what it represents, the question is well, what it does is the things which our language represents, is that connection between our language and what it is represented constant throughout time, if you got what I mean. And I think that the moment this thing becomes inconstant, or it changes the relationship between what we're saying and what is in the world, that relationship changes, then there's a very big problem which arises. And I think that it's that change which points us towards what you're discussing as, or describing as, the late Wittgenstein's idea, and away from my idea, because I think my idea only works when you can have a constant relationship between the words and the physical reality, and that structure and that sense of interaction is exactly the same, if you got what I mean. And the moment you change that, then the argument fails as well.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any utility. And I think we have to take in mind that although this is a very abstract discussion, there's really some true bearing onto how we should view our world, and what we're trying to investigate here when we say does our language, does one concept, one word correspond to a single set of things, or is there kind of family resemblance? Is what are we really doing when we're living or talking to each other? And I think this is when philosophy gets really interesting, because it really intersects with reality and our living world. And I think also it may be a problem with theists. I'm not really sure whether it will be true, because if every word is mutable, then how about the word God? When we say the word God, we can definitely mean a lot of different things when we say God. That's for sure. But then whenever we say God, can we really mean that one God that we're trying to say, or can our definition of God be sufficient for what God is?
Well, I'll say that it's less so a problem of the theists in the way you present, but I think I completely agree with you that there is definitely a problem there in the overarching idea of language in general. But because when I'm thinking about, let's just use a mic, for example, that's a mic. I mean, are we saying that that's a mic because it has a property of looking like a mic? Or is it a mic because it has a property to receive, or it is made to receive volume and convey it to the computer? And then if we say that is a mic because it conveys volume to a computer, which I think is a very reasonable thing, then the problem is, or what then arises, is that, well, what would we say? Is it because a chair then, because then it seems that following that same reasoning, the chair is a chair because you can sit on it, or it is made to be sat on.
But the problem with the problem with you defining the mic as something to be sent to the computer is that a mic can be sent to a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And even when we're on Discord and we say we turn on the mic, we're not saying that there's a physical mic there. It's just the mic is just the I guess the toggle. Yeah. Or even when we say we're having a mic and we're speaking to an entire room, it's not necessarily that it's a computer. Or the mic's function then, although it's also transmitting to a computer, it's more a projecting to everyone else.
Yeah, perhaps using the computer as just an example, and perhaps mic is more that which is there to strengthen or broadcast your voice. That might be a better word to use it. But then the problem is that someone would say pass the mic and it's actually a water bottle and you're role playing, if you got what I mean.
Yeah.
And then is that a mic anymore?
And also what does even broadcast mean?
Exactly.
Exactly.
And well, I think we could perhaps separate language into verbs and nouns and adjectives, because I think there are 3 different constructs and perhaps need 3 different classifications to discuss about. But when it comes to nouns, I feel it very hard to separate the nouns from their teleological nature, because it seems that the only relationship you can have between the word and the object in question is that telos, rather than is that property or the shape of that.
I think this is entirely natural, because this also comes from Heideggerian philosophy. Heidegger characterized he said that things are most themselves when they exist as equipment. And what's the property of equipment? What's the being of equipment? It is being ready to hand, being in use by human beings. So when you say that the best way to think of a thing as is to think about its teleos, you're really touching on a very original Heideggerian idea.
Yes. And I think it goes back to Aristotle as well. But then, because we could let me go get your other mic, for example.
Yeah.
Because if you look at this mic and compare it to the mic that I use, they're just very, very different things. They look absolutely different. If you're an ancient person and saw these 2 things, you would think that they're completely 2 different tools. For example, you see, you put this mic here, let's put this mic here, and put this mic here. You wouldn't think they're the same, maybe apart from the fuzzy nature, which makes it look kind of similar.
But what if we take this off and this is on? There's still 2 mics, and this is a very interesting thing, because when we're inside our culture and we get acquainted with this word mic, then we can really understand what it means. And when we encounter new things that almost fits into the category in some way, then we can say that it's a mic. But you're right, when someone ancient or someone who's not acquainted with what a mic is wouldn't think that wouldn't call these 2 the same thing.
Yeah. And that's why I think the understanding of something's telos is fundamentally important for how we describe the words we use for it, and it's the same for nouns. But then the problem with that is, what if that telos of the thing has changed? Like the painting that you've described. And that just provides something which is... Then perhaps you could say, well, when someone draws a chair which is not meant to be sit on, the chair that is drawn is not meant to be sat on, but rather they are still drawing something which is meant to be sat on, if you got what I mean. In the second level of the thing, for example, I'm drawing a TV. Maybe that TV is not meant to be watched, but what I'm drawing is inspired, or it is a replica or a replication of something that is meant to be watched.
But still, the being of the TV that is drawn, or the being of the abstract TV that is put on display, but not meant to be playing anything, but just to be seen. Its fundamental being is not something that we look at, and maybe that's why a lot of postmodern artwork they precisely wants to use this tension of the teleos of the thing when we use it in everyday life, and in contrast with when it's presented in a museum. And there's a sort of really interesting tension going on there, and that's why maybe it's fascinating for us to look at. Let's say is it the latrine? Like that really famous. When we see the latrine inside a museum, then there's a very interesting tension here. Yes. That makes it very interesting.
Yes, you want to go to the bathroom in the latrine,
but then you realize that the latrine is not supposed to be used like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very interesting thing, and perhaps you could solve that difficulty by saying that is art. If you got what I mean. If then you say that art is that which describes or represents a concept, then I think that solves a problem.
So, trying to say that art is that which represents a concept.
Yeah, for example, when you say drawing a chair, that art, which is not meant to be sat on, that is representing a concept of a chair. So while the art itself is not meant to be sat on, and that does not have that property, the chair, that the concept which it is representing, does have that property. So hence we understand it's a chair, but also know that we don't need to sit on it because it is art. So that art acts as the external factor, which then puts it into another category instead of the chair. And then we just understand that that is representing the chair or the concept of the chair.
Well, I don't really understand what you're saying by representing the concept of the chair. But I think are you trying to say that because let's say when we have the chair in the museum, there's another factor acting on the chair, in that the chair is not only a chair, but it's also an artwork. And then
perhaps the best way to look at it is the artwork or the thing in the museum first a chair, or is it first an art? Because if it's first an art, then you calculate it with the properties of art and not that of the chair.
But then in the museum, we would still call that a chair.
Yes.
So you see our that one word a word cannot be limited to anything. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
So when we say a chair, I think what we have established here is a chair can have very different teleos and still be a chair in very different settings. Perhaps they are really two different things, and we can create different words for it. But then I guess the problem with us creating a new word for the chair and the artwork chair is that in the original chair we can still find new divisions.
Yeah.
Within.
And I think that's definitely possible, because if you look at set theory, there could be this set and then there's subsets and then further things.
And
I
guess also the problem with us just plainly defining a chair as let's say things that we can sit on, and then when in this sense, when other people goes to the museum and sees that chair and they call it a chair, we will say that no, you're doing it wrong. It is not called a chair. We're really artificially sort of sterilizing our language.
Well, perhaps, but then I think that's sort of the discussion of what it is, whether it's an artwork. I think is very important, and perhaps can help solve our problem and maintain my original discussion. Is the sense that, well, yes, it is a chair, but at the same time, we're not meant to sit on it, or it is not the purpose of that is not meant to be sit on it, is because it is first an artwork. For example, I'm first a child. I have first responsibility to my parents. Then I have responsibility to friends around us, or perhaps that's not even a good decoration. Perhaps the Mao Tai thing in the fridge, and I don't know why I'm using it as an example so much, but then you have the Mao Tai there. It's at first a decoration, then it is a container, if you get what I mean. We're not meant to necessarily break or drink out of that container because it is decoration in the first place.
I think I would agree with you, but I want to modify it a bit, in the sense that I wouldn't want to say that there's this one object and there's a lot of different predicates that we can shove onto the object, and then there's like different orders on in how we're going to do it. I think it's almost like a thing is a thing by virtue of its context, the relations it has with all the other things around it. Let's say the Mao Tai when it is inside what do you call it? Well, when it is inside the drawer, it is not something that we can drink. Or when it is displayed there, it is a display. But when we have the Mao Tai on the table next to a lot of a lot of plates, a lot of food, it becomes a Mao Tai to drink. So I almost want to say that things can change its being through its relationship to other things, its distance to other things.
Yeah, and I think that perhaps remains a thing, in the idea that yeah, I'll agree with that in the sense that the X, then that would kind of create a further problem. It's like the X has a property P such that it is in category Z, but then that X itself can have different properties under different areas, but remain being X and remain being in Z, but then also have further things which block or change it, right?
Yeah.
But perhaps a more physical way to represent it would be the painting or the drawing or the artifact over there, and it's just basically to tell or can I show it to them?
Yeah, it's my sister's.
Yes. It's a very artistic person. I don't think I'll ever be able to draw something like this myself, but you can see there's this artistic thing here. you can see that there's trees. This is a tree. That is like an animal. But first of all, we know that this is an art. The aim or the telos of this decoration is to represent the concept, but it is not itself the actual thing, if you got what I mean.
So are you trying to say that art is representation?
It's a representation.
How about,
yes.
let's say, how about Jackson Pollock?
Well, it is a representation of his chaotic energy, or perhaps his chaotic psychological state.
Well, I would say that you're expanding representation so far.
Exactly, that's the problem. Or perhaps art is an expression of expression of the artist's opinions, or expression of the artist's thoughts.
Well, that's a very romantic view of viewing things.
I have a very romantic view of things. Like,
I think, I would almost want to say that when we say art, there are a lot of different things that we mean by art. There's the romantic artwork, which is really the expression of someone's inner state. But there's also the artwork like the Aeneid. Okay, the Aeneid, written by Virgil. I'll just give you some background. It's commissioned by, I think, Augustus, the emperor of Rome by the time, for Virgil to write this piece of artwork that helps to represent the culture, the spirit of the Roman people. Then we wouldn't say that it's not an art just because Virgil is not expressing himself but trying to capture the spirit of Rome. It's still an art, but it's an art in a very different way than the art that you're trying to say.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that I think art has such a broad definition that it's very hard to put it into one. I think that's why perhaps you could say just art is an expression. And that's perhaps the best we can do. It's an expression. And what is an expression of? Then, well, that's a very interesting question which cannot be answered because, and it's impossible to answer. Like, well, what exactly is art? If you got what I mean, it's just an expression.
And maybe Wittgenstein would just say that you're talking bullshit.
Yes, exactly.
When you say what is art, you're saying meaningless propositions.
Exactly. The problem is that but we clearly use art as a useful terminology. If you got what I mean.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can say that we use art in such a way that it doesn't signify. It's whenever we use art, we also point to a particular thing. There's no category to the whole idea. You get what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's no complete set of art that just exists there, and there's a predicate that you can describe everything. But what we say as art, we always point to the particular, and each art is art not by virtue of itself, but by virtue of its surroundings.
But yes, but then just for an interesting case study, models, right?
Yeah.
Would you consider them as art? Because I mean, they're going on the catwalk or putting pictures on Instagram of themselves. Mm-hmm. Would they be art then? In the same way that someone would show off their drawing or show off perhaps their painting or book?
It's very hard to say. I think it would depend on the context again. Yeah. Let's say if there's a model who stands there for like a month. You see, just stands in the same pose the entire month. That would be... You definitely call that art.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
But when they're just walking around, or it also depends on the taste. It depends on what they wear. So it's very hard to say. And then again, we can ask, what do you mean by a model?
Exactly.
We can't say that a model is someone who's beautiful walking around.
Yeah, exactly.
You see, recently, there's like a surge of models who's not that attractive.
Yeah. Like me and you, we could become models by not being very attractive.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a very interesting thing. It's like, well, and then that's why I think the teleological understanding is just so important. It's like a model is that which purpose is to show something off.
And I want to add, I think this is completely right, but I think we've also found out something else. It's something derives its teleos by its relationship with in its context.
Yeah.
A chair's teleos in my house is to be sat, but when the chair gets transported into a museum, it has a different relationship to the surrounding, and its being it has a different being. And this is why I guess a scientific description of a chair would be insufficient.
Definitely.
Well, even a kind of set theory explanation of a chair, and then because if you want to say that, you have to say that when a chair is in such and such place, in such and such condition, with such and such thing surrounding it, then it would not be a chair, but be an artwork of a chair. And you can imagine this will expand to infinity, and it wouldn't be a useful characterization. It would seem very ad hoc.
Yes.
So I guess what I'm trying to get at is a thing it's teleos. You can define a thing by its teleos, but you can only define its teleos by its its surrounding with other things, which also has their own teleos.
Yes, definitely.
So there's almost a kind of impossibility here that we're investigating.
Yes, I would agree with you. And I think that's why I think the fundamental thing is that language is useful, and that's kind of it. Language is a tool, which is somewhat like a later Wittgenstein's idea.
Language is a tool, but I feel like when you say that language,
but then it's insufficient though at the same time, in the sense that there seems to be, although it is a tool, there seems to be something which is objectively true about language.
What do you mean objectively true about?
In the sense that, well, despite I could say that that's a mic, and then, well, okay, the Chinese word for microphone is almost the same as the English one. Let's say the beer, right, or like wine, and then in Chinese like zhou, and then like in Spanish like vino or vino, and then like you can see there's three different words, but there's something objectively like.
Well, I would say they're still different in some sense.
I mean, they're different
because look, when we use the word wine, we not only think about wine, it's also connected with the cultural connotations of wine. Let's say a Greek person who says wine would think about the Dionysian festival, but then let's say a Chinese person who talks about wine may be about like this big family gathering and having fun, drinking, taking shots with like your I don't know your uncle or something, and then maybe
drink responsibly, kids.
And also maybe an American who's thinking about wine or beer would think about like being inside a bar. So there's almost a difference. And then I think what you're trying to get at with the kind of objective quality, are you trying to say maybe somehow the language is socially determined? So
it's like that language is, there's truth to language which cannot be changed, in the sense that 1 + 1 would always be 2. Or 1 加1一定是2. Like it just cannot be any other way. And I mean you could technically call 1 2 and say 2 + 2 = 1, and just have that concept of 2 = 2, if you got what I mean.
Wait, sorry, I didn't follow.
Like, so basically you can have, like, no matter what you call certain things, there is something about language which cannot be changed, in the sense that it's representation or it's really hard. But perhaps you could say that, then perhaps you could come back and say, well, language is that which represents reality. But then you could ask, well, how well does it represent reality?
Well, how do you even know it's representing reality? How can you have access to reality in itself, or be completely sure that you have access?
Well, I don't think that's a problem of skepticism or solipsism. It's impossible to be 100% certain that you're not the only mind in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps you can't even be certain that you're thinking. But I mean, perhaps you can be, but like it's like you only know you're thinking because you're thinking, and that's just kind of circular. But then it shows that there's somewhat sense of like there's limits to language.
So I guess that's like the critique. That's like the critique of cogito ergo sum, that it's not actually a syllogism.
Yeah.
It's just a statement.
Yeah, it's a statement which I think is under severe inspection is somewhat, or if not totally, circular.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps somewhat of a reason why I think that we do think rationally in axioms, is that we have to have these certain kind of principles, otherwise we just cannot build beyond that, because we live based on fundamentally circular notions that cannot be fully explained or fully defended by itself.
But I don't see why that matters.
Yeah.
You think, at least in most cases, maybe not in mathematics or sciences, but when we're just going in our daily life, it doesn't really bother us.
Exactly.
That's our chair is not rigidly defined. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. I'll completely agree with that, in the sense that perhaps our discussion here is useless. It's like it's philosophically interesting, and it does demonstrate that our discussion or understanding the world is not based on purely scientific means. But when going beyond that to really figure out what is the fundamental nature of the thing is that you cannot fully define how we got it, because it seems that we originally got it from its teleological nature, but we've also now have further connotations which go beyond and not completely defeat that teleological nature, and have just fully become just what the form is, if you got what I mean. And it's that constant change about the language and what it represents and how we get to that language, that relationship, which makes it impossible to fully understand what it actually is. It's lost all its sense of form and is in some sense of no man's land between two definite answers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a very difficult topic to wrap your head around. But I think it's very useful to think about it in some sense, because somehow there's a mode of our being that is I won't say that we look at the world in the lens of language, but there's also sometimes there's a lot of times that how we see things or how things appear to us, the things being to us, is affected by our language.
I definitely think that's the case, because it seems that a baby, like I have like a lot of young cousins, and I see them quite more recently. They look at a TV or they look at something and they say, well, what is it? They don't understand what it is.
Yeah.
Then the moment they understand it, they view it as that thing. For example, when we are now, we see that, we immediately identify it as a television. And along with that television, we identify its purpose.
Yeah.
But a baby, if I get my cousin to look at that, they'll look at it and say, well, what exactly is it? If you got what I mean. They'll be looking at that and say, well, it's a shape. I see it for what it physically is. There's no, and perhaps in a more scientific way, but they don't have the connotation, and that's the question, if you got what I mean.
Yeah. And Heidegger would say that we take a lot of things for granted when we're moving around, the teleos of the thing. And it's only when things break down, when things don't work, that we can start investigating it. If you get what I mean. It's only when, let's say I want to watch TV, and then I find out, maybe I went to a different place and I find out this TV actually doesn't have a remote control. This TV uses some other means to turn on. It's only then that we realize the kind of nature of the TV, you see?
Yes, indeed, and I completely agree with it. And I think that's a very interesting point, which I think is completely undeniable. I think it's very helpful. And I'll completely agree with that. But before we go on, for the two people who are watching right now, I hope you're enjoying the live stream, our discussion. I know we said that we're going to talk about transcendent Aristotle and Marxism, but I think we are indeed only going to be able to talk about it in its form of there being in only talking about the language and telos right now. I think that's the only way we could talk about it. In its form. To those who are watching, someone said something in the comments. Unfortunately, I cannot read Russian, so I'm going to put that in Google Translate right now. So hopefully I can understand what you're saying. I'm glad you are in the chat. So I hope for those watching that you guys can go check out Warren's YouTube channel and also his podcast, because that is very interesting. The more I'm doing this advert, the more views I'm getting. Now we're going from 0 views to 3 views now. So that's very interesting. So you asked, what's with the hand? Well, I hurt my hand and I had a surgery, but now it's all good. Now it all feels way better. It's all good.
It's the right hand. So you never know what Josh was trying to do with it.
Yes, well, I actually injured it in a football match. So that's definitely a good thing to keep in mind. And it's definitely something which is way safer now. And it has indeed helped with a lot of issues, because it's helping me learn how to use my left hand and appreciate life in a bit of a new fashion. So that's definitely something interesting. But I think we've covered this topic quite a lot. I mean, I think it's definitely perhaps a very interesting thing to discuss, and I'm very grateful that we discussed it. But perhaps for the last 10 minutes of our discussion, we can perhaps move on to a bit of another discussion, if you got what I mean. Just a short discussion or short thinking about perhaps the need of transcendence, or the nature of transcendence. Or we could save that to a next broadcast. What do you think?
Well, I guess we can talk about it here. Or even if you have more time, we can just talk about it even longer.
Because I'm indeed picking up a friend at 5:45. Okay. But actually that means we have 30 odd minutes left till that. So I think we can talk a bit more about that. So that's all good.
Okay. So I guess what do you mean by transcendence? Because there's a lot of different ways that you can talk about transcendence.
And I think the sense that I'm using here, or perhaps we shouldn't talk about the transcendence, we should talk about socialism, because we have Marx and Engels. I think that might be an easier thing to talk about now than talk about the transcendence, because that goes into Dostoevsky. Not to say that I favoritize Dostoevsky. I say there's more to talk about him, but I do think it's definitely a more interesting thing to discuss or approach. And that deserves its own channel. And perhaps later when we do upload this into the podcast, we could separate this into two sections. One of this is indeed the thinking part of it, the language thing, the other things about Marx and Engels. But I mean, what are your thoughts on communism? What are your thoughts on socialism? And let's hope we don't end up somewhere where we don't want to tomorrow.
No, I think I've become more appreciative of Marxist thought, not necessarily of like communism or socialism per se, but I think Marx himself has a lot of great things to contribute. I wouldn't want to comment on. I guess one can say that a lot of communist and socialist regimes have failed miserably. A lot of people would argue that it's because they haven't really been communist or socialist. But I guess it, and if you think about Marx's historical prophecy, you can definitely say that it hasn't really worked out very well. But there are a lot of things that Marx identified that is very interesting. And I think one of them is alienation.
Yes. I think the thing with Marx is that I think he has a very good starting point.
Mm-hmm.
What he says, what he critiques about the capitalist system is not wrong. It's just that the problem of the opposite is perhaps even greater. But I think what we're saying here, and I think what we do agree with Marx is, well, what are the problems of capitalism? And that might be something that we want to talk a bit more about. And whether that is truly, whether the problems of capitalism itself outweigh or are greater than the problems risen by socialism.
I guess the thing I don't like to just use like these big words like capitalism. Well, what are we really talking about when we're talking about capitalism? Do you think?
I think it's a free transmission of capital or money or trade or whatever the hell the thing which is being changed around is. You get what I mean? Like people used to use money as seashells. That was capital for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's perhaps one of the things that
and capitalism would be also the accumulation of capital.
Yes. The funny thing is that sometimes socialism is very similar to capitalism in the sense that no matter wherever you go, you see like the social democratic states right now in Sweden, they say that's a very good socialist country. They're fundamentally based on fundamentally economically capitalist systems.
Well, I would want to say this.
Thing.
My comment would be something like, as a family, I am communist. Maybe in a village or in my town, I am socialist. In my city, I'm a social democrat. In terms of the entire country, I'm a capitalist.
Mm-hmm.
Get what I mean? I think social or like these kind of top-down control becomes worse and worse. The more abstract the entity that's controlling is, because let's say there's definitely I think the attraction of this kind of communistic ideal is definitely there because it's what we have as a family. And Aristotle said the basic constituent of the state is the family. And I think that's also the problem why a lot of, I guess, one can say pseudo-communistic states would have to abolish the family or try to disrupt the family because they're trying to replace the family with this way bigger family of like the entire nation or entire humanity.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that because I think when we talk about what the virtues or the values of Marxian theory, they're fundamentally very good values in the sense that people should be treated equally and treated with respect. Although I dare say that at least the version or the formulation of the Communist Manifesto feels way more like resentment than a sense of equality. And
I guess the Communist Manifesto is more of a propaganda piece.
Yes, I definitely.
The real theory. I guess because both of us haven't really dived really deeply into capital, we don't have that much right to talk about to critique his idea that much. We can only talk about general things about it. But I guess I want to move on to a kind of what do you think are the problems with capitalism and like or just say the problem with a kind of I wouldn't want to say capitalism, but this kind of modern society. Maybe like let's say post World War II, especially epitomized in America, maybe.
Well, I think the problem is that the problems of capitalism, or whatever we want to call the society, is a necessary precondition or is a necessary outcome of the benefits of capitalism. In the sense that you cannot have people, like there's a fundamental truth, I think, about any society is that you cannot have a society filled with billionaires and at the same time you can't have a society filled with poor people. The problem with capitalism is the same as what we see in any of the socialistic areas, is that the moment you have everyone moment you have free market, there is going to be winners and there is going to be losers.
And it won't be completely fair either, because luck plays a role.
Yeah, it's like running a race. There is always going to be winners and losers in a marathon.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's the person who wins or the person who loses is not necessarily the best or necessarily the worst. Mm-hmm. And you say luck plays a role, and that's definitely true. I think luck.
And also, but the problem is, I don't think just because luck plays a role, we cannot just say that this system is completely corrupt. Because I think there's a problem. There's a lot of critique of meritocracy in left, especially like the extreme left. But I guess it is right that it is wrong that I guess free market and the ideals are based on this kind of meritocratic system. And even if it's not completely meritocratic, I think it is wrong to say that because it is not meritocratic that the system has to be completely abolished. And or say that just because it's not meritocratic, the people at the top does not have their own merits. Because I think the system is at least not completely corrupt. Or let's say if you believe that the system is meritocratic, you'll go a lot further than someone who believes that it's completely unequal. And that's why I'm really mad at a lot of I wouldn't say extreme left, the extreme left, the far left kind of propaganda saying that let's say the minorities are oppressed from birth, and because by saying that they're really really making the minorities situation worse. Because let's say if you're told that you're not going to succeed, then of course you won't succeed, and vice versa. If you're told that you're going to succeed, you're going to work hard and you're going to try to succeed.
If I told you you're a failure since you're a kid, you're going to believe you're a failure.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like a self-defeating project, if you got what I mean. Greetings, brothers. Christ is risen. Yes, indeed, Christ is risen to you. I am joined with my atheist friend. No, he's actually my agnostic friend here. But yeah, glad you're enjoying this. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you want to ask us any questions, right now we're having a bit of a freer discussion on communism and Marxism. But if you want to say anything or just give us any questions, leave them in the chat. I'll make sure I keep my eyes on that, if you got what I mean. But I completely agree with you on that. Is that the moment you try to define someone at the point of their birth, it defeats the entire purpose and the potential that they have in their lives. For example, my grandparents, or my great-grandparents, or my great-great-grandparents, they went to America with literally nothing. And I'm not sure if it's the same with your family, but in a lot of Chinese families, especially in the Guangzhou region, a lot of them went to either America or Australia to mine gold, to work at the really poor areas, to work as servants. And they earned a lot of money there that way. And when I mean a lot of money, it was like money compared to that which is earned in China.
And I guess also you can see that hard work really has something to it, because if you see the Asian Americans, the success rate is much higher than other minorities. Even though one cannot say that there's no racism towards them. There's definitely racism.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I was racially abused in America. That was quite funny. They said, "Oh, you were eating dogs," but to be honest, I made that joke about myself like every single day almost. But I mean, there is something to it when someone else who is not Asian says that to you, which makes it slightly a bit more racist, if you got what I mean.
But I want to say something a bit controversial. Yes. Okay, I want to say that the state shouldn't really, I guess, try to. I need to try to form it in a way that's not so. The state shouldn't get involved into personal business, like the business involving personal beliefs.
I definitely agree.
In a sense that the state has to ensure that every citizen has the same rights, but what the citizens believe and where each citizen discriminates against someone else is not really the issue of the state, at least a lot of times. Because I read this piece by Hannah Arendt. She's talking about forced integration of schools, and she's saying this is a complete failure of the parents, in the sense that by integrating schools, let's say if you push a lot of African American children into, let's say, majority white schools, you're really sacrificing the children for a political cause. It's completely immoral to do so. You see?
Yeah.
Because let's say if the children's pushed, and like what we said before, if they're discriminated at the start by everyone else, and then there's all these prejudices against them. They're of course not likely for them to feel good and to succeed in the future. And you see, there's no. What I want to say is, a lot of times we say discrimination as a bad word, but a lot of times we discriminate all the time in our lives.
Yeah.
And somehow some type of discrimination just pops out.
And I discriminate amongst my friends a lot as well. I mean, I would rather spend more time with someone like you than someone else, perhaps, because it's just genuinely perhaps more intellectually stimulating to spend time with you. But if you get what I mean, it's like sometimes even the form of discrimination isn't even a result of the skin color.
Yeah.
If you got what I mean. I think that's a problem with.
I think it's also a difference of culture a lot of times. You see, like for example, in our school, like the Asian kids naturally go with the Asian kids, and the Western kids goes with the Western kids.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily because we hate the Western kids or anything. I'm very happy to talk with them and interact with them. I have no problem with it. But somehow there's this very, I guess, very nuanced difference in culture.
And it's perhaps even a more smaller difference in the fact that I normally don't really socialize outside you and a few other people. It's because I genuinely don't think there's much to talk about with them. I'm not the kind of guy who likes talking random stuff, unfruitful or like meaningless small talk for like a long time. I just can't do that. I mean, some people can, and I was talking with Jenny after our debate competition. I was talking about it forever. I mean, I was like, I definitely enjoyed the experience, but I can't sustain that for a long time, if you got what I mean. And it got nothing to do with race at all, and that's a problem with what you call it, class. I think class, when you try to define something as a class struggle, be it race or money or capital, class struggle, there's always going to be some problem with it because people are so much more intricate than their class.
Yeah, and that's the problem that we're talking beforehand about language.
Yeah,
you cannot even define a class.
Yeah, exactly. But I dare say that language is perhaps a bit more precise than or less complex than the human composition, if you got what I mean. Though I dare say that I dare say I'm thoroughly convinced that there is something very weird about language, which is perhaps just it's a pursuit which is interesting but ultimately unobtainable, if you got what I mean. But the same thing goes with class, and I think the same thing goes with the idea of discrimination and hard work. Is that yes, sir, you might face discrimination. Yes, that might be true, but you should not let that just. I think by making a very big deal about that discrimination, you're trying to let that discrimination define who you are. You're making that discrimination reflect upon you, and there's a problem or a gap.
Yeah. For example, let's say we're international students applying to the U.S. A lot of the international student acceptance rate into the U.S. is way lower than U.S. native students, and you can call that a form of discrimination. You can say that it's unfair, but what can we do about it?
Yeah.
We really just have to try our best. And you can even say that there's a rationale behind that discrimination. Because
clearly the US should prioritize US students. Yeah. It's like one of the problems where I see that and in some forms of critical race theory say the government legislation is actively against black people. That's we could put that aside. But then some people say the law is actively against immigrants or especially illegal immigrants. Well, what exactly do you expect the country to do? Give all the money, give all the tax-paid money to people who haven't paid tax and are knocking at the door. I mean, yes, as someone who is perhaps, we are somewhat in a similar situation when we're going to unis overseas. It's that, well, what exactly do you expect them to do? They have to put their own country, their own citizens first as just a practical and a reasonable approach. You can't be charity to other people.
Well, maybe I think it becomes very difficult to talk, I guess, rationally or reasonably about these kind of things when I guess topics like immigration is labeled is filled with these kind of general labels without considering of the content. It's like once you talk about immigration and the problem with maybe immigration and maybe having to limit immigration to some degree, people immediately say that, oh, you're racist, you're this or that, and That's a very unproductive way of discourse. It really just ends the discourse and fails for anyone to make any common ground. And I've heard a very interesting conversation. It's like once you hear people use these kind of terminologies, no matter like on extremes of both political ends, then you would. It's just better for you to not participate in their game, in their kind of in the language game, because there's a lot of language games that's self-contained. A lot of people's like self-contained into their conception of the universe, and it's almost futile for you to try to convince them.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like, what exactly can you say to someone who believes fully to their heart that the entire universe is out to get them and wants to discriminate and harm them for the rest of their life? What exactly can you say to those people? For example, there's some people I was talking about the what they call it, the Hong Kong protest movements. They have such a mentality that the entire universe and the entire government is out to kill them, that it's impossible to have a discussion with them. It's because their fundamental presupposition is a presupposition that I am a constant victim of further oppression. And if you start off with that as one of your starting points of philosophy or your worldview, it's impossible for you to break free of that mold. It's very difficult to break free of that.
It's not only, I guess I would have to add that it's not only that one kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also all other forms of assumptions that it's very difficult for you to. And I guess this is why humor is so important.
Yeah.
It's like, I wouldn't want to say this publicly, but in our school, this is kind of poet laureate kind of thing. And then there was this poem written for International Women's Day. I wouldn't name the person who read the poem. I respect the person behind it.
Same, yeah.
She's my friend, but the poetry I think she herself was also embarrassed by the poetry. But so basically, she wrote a poem for International Women's Day because that's what. So she wrote this poem and about like oppression, misogyny, and these kind of things, and it's kind of over the top.
Yeah.
In the sense that. In our school, there's not that much of the thing, and even in the Western world, although there's still a problem, it's not as extreme as she's framing it. But I don't think she herself believes in that. It's almost like she knows that the school is expecting something like that to be sent to her, and it's very scary to me in the sense that because she's a very reasonable person, but
that's why people like us are somewhat outcast in the school, or at least perhaps me more than you in the sense I physically have the reputation of being more conservative than you, perhaps. In the sense that I actually, and perhaps it's good reason I actually don't care about what people think about that, but it's like, it gets to the best of us because there is no other choice, if you know what I mean. Unless you have complete indifference to the situation around you, it's very difficult to break free of that mold, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I have to check the time.
Okay.
But I mean, you can continue.
Okay, it's monologue from Thinker's Kitchen now.
Yes.
I just find it very scary. And then in our Twitter group, we had like 10 or so boys there, and we were all like trying to laugh because one of the problems with you trying to talk about a social issue using poetry is that I guess there's nothing wrong with it. It can be extremely powerful. You have Maya Angelou, C.R.I.'s. Problem is, when you say something like that, you have to say something substantive.
Yeah.
Or you can't say it in a really ideological way. It almost feels like it scares me because it almost feels impersonal. It feels like there's no subject behind the poem. It's just pure. I guess it's just pure like expectation, or what you expect other people to. Or the school to expect of you.
Yeah, that's why I've completely broken free and I've become the true liberal that they've actually always wanted us to be. I just completely don't care about what their expectations are. I just go full on me. But
I guess also the problem with us using this kind of conservative liberal language or left and right language is that it doesn't
mean anything.
It's not helpful at all.
Yeah.
So I would actually want to suggest to you that you don't say that you yourself is a conservative.
Yeah, true.
Liberal.
Actually, no, I wouldn't say I'm conservative. I'm known as a conservative, but I'm not necessarily conservative. I'm actually quite a liberal person. I'm a very open person. I think that's a better way to say it.
There's this podcaster who I like pretty much, Scott Adams, who's also this comic writer. And then he says he's left to Bernie, but also but cares about human motivation. You see, I think that's a better way to frame things than to say that, oh, I'm conservative or I'm liberal. Because once you frame yourself into one camp, you're alienating half of the population.
But talking about good podcasters, if you've been enjoying this podcast so far, make sure to subscribe and like to Thinker's Kitchen and Dostoevsky for us. If you're listening to us from the YouTube channel, then feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're enjoying this content. I will make weekly videos with Warren, or every week, either it's Saturday, Sunday, or someday during the week. We'll see how they go. Hope you've enjoyed them, and let's get back on into the discussion. I'm not sure how long it takes before my parents will arrive, but
okay,
they will arrive.
It's fine. I feel like there's something very, very great about discussing like in person compared to discussing online. There's a okay. Okay. Sorry.
That was a bit of a distraction.
Sorry, we just got distracted by some social media stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, I deleted Instagram because
I only keep it for football news.
Yeah.
But perhaps since we've almost run out of time, we may as well wrap it off in some bright notes about what we plan to talk about in the next video. I know we've said we were going to talk about the transcendence. However, that's going to be pushed on to the next thing. And I'm probably going to re-upload certain aspects of this onto the channel and onto the Thinker's Kitchen podcast. So if you want to check that out, make sure you go do so. It will really help your life and really help our lives as well. It means a lot to us to gain subscribers. Give my friend Warren some natural subscribers, which aren't all my accounts. And so we can see how that goes. Stay safe, like always. God bless. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.